We're gonna we're ready to go. Floor is yours, sir.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And let me go ahead and share my screen, share my PowerPoint. And here we go. So today we're going to be talking about measuring inclusion, higher profits and happier people. Give me 1 second to move some windows around so that I can actually see. And by the way, since the chat is not working, if anybody has a really pressing question that, in terms of clarity, not understanding something, and you want to just take yourself, I'm assuming it's set up so that you can unmute yourself and ask. And otherwise, as Barry was saying, use the Q&A functionality because the chat seems to be blocked for the time being. So with that, you should be able to see my screen, measuring inclusion, higher profits, and happier people. As Barry mentioned, this is actually the first in a series of presentations. This is the schedule that you can see right here that spans all the way through the end of the year. The exact titles may change slightly, especially given the really massive changes that are taking place right now in the DEI space, or whatever we're going to end up calling it. Some of these titles and some of the content may shift slightly accordingly, but basically it's a whole series of presentations that are all reflecting some of the work that I've been doing now for more than 10 years. And in fact, before I start to tell you my work, I always like to start by addressing what I jokingly call the white elephant in the room, and that's me. As you can see, I'm white, male. I happen to be cisgender, heterosexual. I have no disabilities. And so the question is, what is a guy like me doing in a place like this talking to you about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And as you will see through the presentation, my work is grounded in a kind of a unique analytical approach that I had been applying for several years. I started out as a professor. I was studying neuroscience, but from a really computational perspective. And then I spent about 10 years. So I was there for about 10 years. Then I spent about 15 years as a consultant solving really complex problems for a variety of companies, organizations, government agencies, and they all were shared this idea of complexity, trying to understand really complex systems. And among other things, we do a lot of work on studying organizations. And then 10 years ago, I had this light bulb moment when I thought, well, maybe I can use that work to try to quantify the financial impact of diversity, equity, and inclusion for an individual company. Not so much the statistical, as so many people talk about the business case for DI in terms of statistically how companies seem to change their performance as a function of their level of diversity. Instead, I wanted to be able to go to any single CEO and say, here's how much money you're potentially gaining or losing depending on how you treat your employees. And so that's what brought me to the space about 10 years ago. And since then, I've been incredibly fortunate to be surrounded by amazing people who have helped me to understand a lot of things that I didn't understand. And I understand now just how little I still do understand. But I feel that the work that I'm doing, hopefully you will see the value that I bring to the table. And then the other elephant in the room that I want to talk about is kind of a much darker elephant, which is the DEI backlash. And we saw that. I actually started writing about this several years ago. I could tell that there was a danger of this happening. And then we saw, I think the sort of the watershed moment was when the Supreme Court struck down affirmative action a couple of years ago. And then that spread to other parts of society, including corporate America, including more broadly society, where terms like woke were turned into negative terms, unfortunately. And then, of course, this culminated in early this year when Trump was elected, or after the inauguration, when he immediately started to sign all these executive orders, which are just absolutely devastating. And unfortunately, this is something that there are a lot of reasons for it. And admittedly, there is a tremendous amount of pushback. White supremacy is clearly behind a lot of these kinds of problems, but there are also some problems, and you will hear me speaking very candidly in a little bit today and more in some of the future presentations about some of the mistakes that we in the DI space have made. And one of the big problems that I realized early on, quite a long time ago, is the fact that even though we've been talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, in fact, it started out 10 years ago when I was working in the space, we just talked about diversity and inclusion, and then equity has become a more common term in the last several years. But the reality is that the vast majority of the initiatives, and I would say virtually all of the data that we collect, is focused on diversity alone. And that, as it turns out, creates a problem because what ends up happening is that people are trying to focus on the numbers, the representation, and I will explain to you a couple of ways in which this actually creates some of the challenges. The first thing I want to point out to you is that a lot of times what ends up happening is that even though people talk about the many benefits of a more diverse organization, such as being able to recruit from a broader talent pool, being able to retain those people that you work so hard to recruit, being able to increase your productivity, your innovation, and increasing your reputation, both internally, but also externally by expanding to broader customer bases. Unfortunately, what most people seem to be stuck on is thinking about diversity in recruitment and hiring. And the idea is, I've heard this so many times. We saw this play out so many times where a company would say, oh, we don't have enough. I don't know, for example, we don't have enough Black people. So what do? We go to an HBCU, we hire a bunch of young graduates who identify as Black or African American, and lo and behold, our numbers go up. And look at this. This is great. When we do our next annual DI report, it'll show that the number of people from those ethnic backgrounds have actually increased. However, what's going to happen is that when these kids from these HBCUs or similar, minority serving organizations join the company, they don't feel welcome. Their manager does not know how to deal with them. Their leaders don't look anything like them. And pretty soon what's going to happen is that they're going to leave. And when you do that, of course, it's going to have a negative impact on the diversity of your organization. Not only that, but as the manager now has to post a job again, hire somebody, interview, hire, onboard, that creates disruption within the team, which actually has a negative impact on productivity. And we also see negative reputation in two ways. Internally, because unfortunately, we hear a lot of leaders that say things like, well, we tried it with those people, but it didn't work out. Meanwhile, those people are going out to their friends and saying, this place is not good. Don't go work there, which actually has a negative impact on your recruitment. So you have literally just shot yourself in the foot. You thought you were doing something good, and it actually backfired. Now, I believe that the reason for that is because we're making a profound mistake, which is that we're trying to fix the symptoms. Trying to fix the lack of diversity simply by hiring diverse, and I kind of hate using the term that way, but hiring candidates from diverse backgrounds can backfire and lead to very negative feelings all around, as we're now seeing. And I like to use a very simple analogy. Imagine that you walked into your house in the middle of winter and felt really cold. You look at the thermostat and it reads 50 degrees Fahrenheit. I know how I'm going to fix it. I'm going to light a match under the thermostat. Look, now it reads 60, 70, 80, 90. But meanwhile, the windows are drafty, the front door is wide open, and the roof is leaking. And you will probably burn your fingers, and you might even burn the whole house down, which is exactly what has been happening in the last several years. And in fact, in 2018, so a long time ago, 7 years ago, in April of 2018, I wrote an article in Forbes in which I said, if companies continue to focus on diversity as the sole measure of progress and as a sole yardstick for what we're doing, it's going to lead to backlash. And I specifically said it will lead to complaints of reverse discrimination primarily from white men in companies. Now, how did I foresee that? Well, to me, it was fairly obvious because the claim of reverse discrimination, unfortunately, when we set up the structure in the way that we've seen so commonly in the last several years, we can easily cause people to feel that they're being discriminated against. What do I mean by that? Well, imagine you have a hypothetical company that today has 1,000 employees, of whom roughly 20% identify as white women, 5% identify as women of color, and 5% identify as men of color. So it's going to be something like that bar chart that you see in the middle there. Now, so the remaining 70% is identify as white men. And suppose that now the CEO and the chief diversity officer come out and say, oh, look, we see the light. We see the value of DEI. We're going to set DEI targets, which again are typically only based on representation or diversity. We want to increase the number of white women to 30% and women of color to 8% and men of color to 8% also. But worry not, because, the DEI is so great that it will increase our efficiency or productivity. So we expect that we will grow by a healthy 20% over the next 3 years. And so it will go like from the bar on the left to the bar on the right. However, under most circumstances, unless you really enormously grow the size of the company, you find that the only way to get that is to reduce the number of white men. And if you're a white man and you're being told you cannot get promoted because we have to promote women before you, because we have to promote Black people before you, because we have to promote people with disabilities before you, it feels like discrimination. And so the problem with this argument, it's actually a logical conclusion that this is a form of reverse of discrimination. Really, reverse discrimination kind of doesn't make sense, but it's what people call it. And this is what has made it possible for the administration, the current presidential administration, to essentially foment this kind of hatred against DEI. And now they're saying that it's illegal because superficially, in fact, it is illegal. But what I would suggest to you is that it's the entire argument, the entire approach that is completely flawed. What do I mean by that? Well, again, if you're trying to fix diversity directly, you're fixing the symptoms, but we need to fix the causes. What do I mean by that? Well, the reason why I use those 4 particular buckets is that that's the data that McKinsey and Lean In publish annually to show the representation of those 4 ethnic and gender buckets in the United States across all companies. But it turns out that if you look at the entry level of companies across the US, white men only make up about 34% of the workforce. Now, this was from 2023, but the numbers have not changed all that significantly. But here's what happens as these people advance through the organization. You find that the representation of white men increases dramatically from 34% to 57% at the expense of the other groups. So the problem is not that you need to stuff more people into this, right? You have essentially a leaky bucket. We're losing people. And we know this because we know in every company where we have low diversity, you always see that the retention rates for the people that are underrepresented is always lower retention rates than for, let's say, for white men. And so trying to add more people from the top is like pouring more water into a leaky bucket, just going to make a bigger mess on the floor. And so we need to recognize that we need to stop trying to fight water with fire. We need to figure out the leaks before we can open that faucet more. It makes no sense to try to hire, to be much more aggressive about hiring when you're just turning, it's like a revolving door and you're losing these people. And in the process of doing that, you're getting everybody upset. But what I would like you to think about also is that I believe that historically, part of the reason why we've been focusing on diversity is that after civil rights, when companies actually became more open to hiring people from underrepresented groups and women around the same time, what became obvious is that these people realized that they were not comfortable in the workplace. They were not treated properly. They were ignored. They didn't have the same opportunities. But the only thing that they could measure, the only thing they could see was the level of diversity. Look, I am the only one in the room. There is only a few of us in the company. And so that became the torch that people carried. And we forgot that the underlying issue is actually a little bit different. And what I would like you to think about is the following. Suppose that you're a member of that hypothetical company that I used for the reverse discrimination example. And suppose that it's 3 years later and you open your eyes and you have two options of what you see. Option one is that you see that your company actually reached the exact target levels of representation of women and people of color, but you're still treated like crap. Or option two is that maybe you don't have quite the numbers that you were hoping for, but you've seen some improvement and you find that your ideas are acknowledged. You don't get interrupted in meetings. You're not the one that's always has to take notes. You're not the only one in the room. You're paid fairly for your work and so on and so forth. And if I were to ask each of you individually, which of these do you want? My suggestion is that most of you would want the one on the right. In other words, you don't really want diversity. You want inclusion. There is this tacit assumption that making a company more diverse will make it more inclusive. But what I'm going to argue with you is that it's exactly the opposite, that you need greater inclusion to have more diversity. Now, this might make sense to you as individuals, but one of the things that I really care about is how do I make this interesting for corporate leaders? How do I convince them that they should actually care about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or whatever we're going to end up calling it after this disaster that is happening right now? And my arguments, which as you will see are very neutral business-driven arguments, is very, very different from what most people argue when they want to support the business case for DEI. And what I tell leaders is the following. There's basically two pieces that I ask them to think about. The first part is that if they think about assets and the kind of assets that companies manage, right, they always have tools that can help them to figure out how to manage those assets to get better performance. For example, in finance, we have portfolio management tools that help us to diversify our financial assets to create greater returns. In marketing, we have things like programmatic advertising, which is a set of tools that help us to quantitatively increase the diversity of our advertising efforts to increase sales. But when it comes to our human assets, when it comes to people, we have no tools that can help us to understand what will happen if we change the level of diversity of the company itself. Again, not about hundreds of companies in the world. But if I were to go to your company and wave a magic wand and change the level of diversity, whether it's adding a token person of color in the middle of the company or hiring primarily diverse people from the bottom up, as you see in the bottom left there, or making a truly diverse organization. And if I were to ask any leader, how will this impact your company? The answer is we do not know. So the first step is to acknowledge that if we think of human assets the way that we think of other assets, it's a little bit weird that we do not have any tools that can help us to figure out the impact of diversifying our human assets. The second part of the argument is to point out that this is a big deal. How big of a deal is it? Well, if I were to show you the amount of money that every company in the United States collectively spends in 1 year on advertising, every form of advertising, and how much money the same companies all across the US spend on payroll, and I were to ask you which is bigger, You may be surprised to find out that not only is payroll bigger, it's 30 times bigger. These numbers from 2019, because that was the last major census that I have data for, but they've stayed fairly consistent. So in 2019, companies spent $250 billion on advertising against 7.4 trillion with a T dollars in payroll. So if you are the leader of an organization and you have the single most expensive budget item, because it's true of every company on the planet that people are your most expensive budget item, and you do not know how to optimize that set of assets through diversification, you are failing your responsibility, not just to your people, but to your shareholders, to your board, right? So when you give, and by the way, notice that this argument doesn't say anything about, hey, let's make companies more diverse. I'm just saying, look, you should at least be making the effort to figure out what is the financial impact on your organization. So starting with that, what I then argue with people, as I've already hinted at before, is that the real key is that we should focus on inclusion. And let me show you the definitions that my colleagues and I have evolved over the last 10 years by doing this work, and you will see more examples of exactly what we do and how we do it. But we've come to realize that definitions are very important. And one problem, I think, in DEI is that we have used sometimes very vague definitions. And I will talk about that in a future session. I'll talk specifically about some of that and some of the reasons behind the backlash. And that's one of them, is the fact that if you ask 10 people to define inclusion, you're going to get 10 different answers. And if you ask about equity, there's going to be big arguments about whether it should be equity or equality, or whether it should be kids behind the fence watching a baseball game, or kids picking an apple, or people riding bicycles. But the fact is, we don't really have super clear definitions. Through my work, and you will see some of the scientific background in a few minutes, I've come to the conclusion that one way to define these terms is by pointing out that as an organization, inclusion is what you do, diversity is what you get, and equity is what you want. Now, let me explain to you why I'm saying this and what I mean by it. And I think that it'll become very clear, very, very simple definitions. Let me start with inclusion is what you do. Suppose that you have a team, and this team is the perfect team, by which I mean each individual on the team is working at their absolute peak, and as a team that work really well together. You simply cannot get any higher level of performance than you can with this team. Now, suppose that something happens to an individual on this team that makes them unable to perform at 100%. What's going to happen to the performance of the team as a whole? Well, clearly will decline a little bit. Suppose that now something happens to a second member of the team who also is unable to perform at their peak. Not only will the team's performance decline because of the additional loss in performance, but now you're going to start to see ripple effects, because now the other team members will have to pick up the slack. They may not be able to finish a project on time. Then they will no longer get the most wonderful projects out there. And pretty soon the entire team will get frustrated, and the performance of the team as a whole can decline dramatically. Now, I haven't said anything about gender, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, nothing like that. I'm just making a very, very simple business argument. But it leads to a really profound general conclusion, which is that anything that an organization does that causes any of its employees to underperform because of personal traits will impact the whole organization adversely. And I want you to just think about what this is saying, right? This is just basically saying, look, if you're allowing as a company something to happen that causes one group of people to underperform, you're shooting yourself in the foot.
Hey, Paolo, there's a
Yep.
question in the group that someone had raised their hand on. Do you mind if we could have her go ahead and raise her hand and then
Yeah,
ask
go
a
ahead.
question?
Go ahead.
Could you raise your hand again? You had dropped your hand, and we're going to raise it so we can give you a chance to talk. I think it was Bianca.
Hey, Bianca. And you're on mute. I don't know if you can unmute yourself.
She can talk now. She can take Bianca. Go ahead and take yourself off of mute.
There you go.
Yeah, apologies. I don't believe I raised my hand.
Oh,
It
sorry.
might have been my mistake.
Oh,
Maybe
okay.
maybe it was just one of those floating things that Zoom tends to do. But anyway, okay, then I'll just go ahead and keep going. But again, more than happy to answer questions. So to go back to this, if you think about it, this kind of statement makes sense, because if you think about an organization, the organization is not a building, right? It's not like the building says, "Oh, look, there are black people coming, shut the doors." The organization is nothing but the collection of people, so that whatever the company is doing to its people, it's having an impact on the organization itself. And what is it that makes people able to succeed in their workplace? Well, it's really about satisfaction, right? We know that being satisfied in the work is very, very directly related to your level of performance, your retention rates, etc. So what makes you satisfied at work? Well, it's all the kinds of things that happen to you. It's about being able to balance your personal life with your work life. It's about using the skills that you were trained to do. It's about having career opportunities. It's about being respected and recognized for your work. And here is the key that ties it to my definition of inclusion as what you do. To the extent that different groups have different experiences, they will have different levels of satisfaction, which means that they will perform differently. And to me, this is what inclusion is all about, right? Being inclusive as an organization, it means that you're doing what is needed to ensure that all groups are able to have the same kinds of experiences, regardless of their identity traits. And if you're failing to do that, then you're not being inclusive. Now, it turns out that in addition to being a relatively intuitive definition of inclusion from the point of view of an organization, it turns out that it's actually possible to use this idea to quantify the impact of not being inclusive. And I'm going to show you how inclusion leads both to greater diversity and greater performance, or conversely, how exclusion leads to less diversity and less performance. And this is where you see kind of the geeky scientist background that brought me to this work. So I spent the last literally 30 some odd years, almost 35 years, in fact, including my PhD was more than 35 years, building computer simulations that focus on capturing individual behaviors and how they interact with each other. And in this particular case, I'm showing you a computer simulation of a company that consists of 4 levels of people: entry level, management, VPs, and executives. For simplicity, there are only 2 kinds of people, yellow and blue, which I will tentatively identify as women and men. I'm not suggesting that gender is binary and we can put whatever level of diversity you want, but you'll see in a moment why this is a very powerful way to make an important point. So here I'm going to start the simulation. You see, this is literally simulating day-by-day activities. Some people get promoted. Some people turn gray and disappear. They're the ones that are leaving the company, either quitting or getting terminated. But the punchline is that when you run the simulation, even though there is randomness, you will always find that roughly you stay 50-50 men and women all the way up and down the organization. So then I asked myself, what if there was a bias in the way that people were treated in the company? Specifically, what if when we have to promote people, we give the men a slight leg up over the women? Not that that ever happens in real organizations, right? But so what I did is I took the same exact simulation and I simulated a form of exclusion by assuming that whenever a promotion is available from one level to the next, the probability of being promoted is a little bit higher if you're male or blue than if you're female or yellow. So let's see what happens. We start with exactly the same company running 50-50. I made this video go a little bit faster. I run it for the equivalent of 5 years after changing just one parameter, and this is what the results look like. We see that at the executive level, we now have 80% men, at the VP level, 70% men, and so on down. And at the entry level, we actually have more women than men, even though in the simulation, we're hiring at the bottom layer the same number of men and women, because the women are stuck at the bottom while their male counterparts are getting promoted. And this should look eerily familiar, because this is exactly what so many organizations look like. And it turns out that this similarity is not just superficial. With my colleague Qibin Zhang, we published an academic paper a couple of years ago in which we showed that we could take the data from McKinsey and Lean-In, and we could match with a high degree of accuracy the gender imbalance that we see across every industry in the United States, simply by making an adjustment to that one parameter. Essentially, how much of a gender bias is there overall that influences the probability of being promoted from one level to the next. So this gives you very, very strong evidence that inclusion drives diversity, or exclusion drives lack of diversity. But I said earlier that inclusion also drives performance. One of the beauties of using a computer simulation is that we can measure things that would be very difficult to measure in human beings. In particular, we can track a variable in these people's brains that we call satisfaction. And satisfaction, just like it works in real people, it tends to stay fairly high unless something negative happens. In this case, the only negative thing that can happen in the simulation is if you get passed over for promotion, meaning that someone junior to you at your level gets promoted before you do. When that happens in the simulation, the satisfaction dips temporarily, and then it slowly comes back up. And then it dips if you get passed over again, it will dip again. So what happens when we look at the overall satisfaction of the men and the women? So here it's simulating those 5 years or 10 years of simulation. And you see that at the beginning, on the left side of the screen, the satisfaction is high for both men and women. As the simulation progresses, you see that there are some fluctuations because randomly some men will occasionally get passed over promotion too. But because it happens much more frequently to women, what we see is that the level of satisfaction of the men remains very high, while the overall level of satisfaction of the women drops dramatically, even though they don't know that they're being discriminated against. It's simply by virtue of the fact that they happen to notice more frequently at the individual level that they're getting passed over for promotion. Now, think back about that example with the stick figures and their satisfaction. What's going to happen to these women whose level of satisfaction is lower? Well, they will perform less, which means that they're going to be producing less and making fewer revenues for you. So you're going to be losing money because your revenues are going down because of the lower productivity of these people that are not treated as well as the others. You're also going to incur costs because these people are going to be less likely to stay. And if these people are leaving and you have to rehire them, it's going to cost you a lot of money, which is why I said that not only is inclusion what you do and diversity is what you get, but it's why I said that equity is what you want. And we can see that very clearly in this chart, because in an equitable organization, those two lines would be on top of each other. The fact that there is a gap between the level of satisfaction of one group and the other is a manifestation of inequity. And this inequity costs you money. You are literally throwing money out the window. And if you could only understand what you're doing that is less inclusive toward women than men in this particular example, but of course we could use any kind of diversity, any kind of identity that we wanted to. If you could identify those factors that are creating this inequity and drive that inequity to zero, you would be making more money. Do you see that how this is profoundly different from the way that most people think about DEI? We're not saying sprinkle magic diversity dust and all this wonderful stuff will happen. We're saying you're bleeding out money right now for really dumb reasons. And if you can figure out what those reasons are and fix them, you will make more money. And my team and I have developed an interactive calculator that you can find on our website that estimates for any size company how much money they're likely to be losing because of the fact that they're treating women and people of color less well than they're treating white men. And I invite you to go play with the calculator. But it turns out that these numbers are not insignificant. They're pretty big numbers. We estimate that a typical company will be losing between 20 and 30% of their net profits every year just by virtue of not being fully inclusive. So hopefully what this has helped you to understand is that we need to stop arguing or asking ourselves how diversity impacts performance and recognize that it's actually inclusion that is the bedrock of a company that is more diverse, more equitable, and more highly performing. And in fact, I would argue that the reason why the correlation between diversity and performance is there, but often it's very weak, and there is a lot of noise if you ever look at the data, it's because it's not diversity itself that causes performance. It's the greater inclusion that allows you to have a more diverse organization and more highly performing company. And that's why those two things tend to be correlated. So if you buy all of this, it leads to a very important question, which is that, well, why the heck are companies not measuring inclusion? I think that there are several reasons. Among them, the fact that, as I said, inclusion is defined very loosely. Also, you will notice that I've been very careful about talking about inclusion from the point of view of the organization. That's very different from, let's say, asking people how they feel and whether they feel included. I'll come back later as to why that's actually kind of the wrong sort of question to ask. But really, I want to know from the point of view of the organization, are there differences in the way that people experience the workplace for different, depending on their identity? And by the way, I'm seeing here a poll. I'm going to, host and panelists can't vote, so I'm going to close it down. But so the main reason why I think that inclusion is not measured is because inclusion itself is actually invisible. And I purposefully wrote the word invisible so that you can barely see it on the screen. What do I mean by that? Well, one way to help you understand that is to draw an analogy between inclusion and health. Now, normally what I say is that when I introduce myself, I don't say, hi, I'm Paolo, I'm very healthy. But like today, for example, for those of you that were on early, I mentioned that I've been traveling and that I picked up some kind of a lung disturbance. And so I may cough and I may say something. So what's the point there? We tend to notice when we're sick more than we notice when we're healthy. And inclusion works exactly the same way. We're much more likely to notice when something negative happens to us that maybe makes us feel excluded than when everything is just hunky-dory. It turns out that this very simple analogy leads to a very important observation. If you're a very healthy individual, you probably don't know a lot about diseases. There are some diseases that you may never even have heard the name of. Even if somebody tells you the name, you don't know what the symptoms are. If somebody tells you what the symptoms are, you may not realize how severe they are. And you sure as heck do not know how to heal the disease. And inclusion and exclusion work exactly the same way, meaning that exclusion is hardest to see and to fix for those who are the most included. But whereas health is a condition that tends to impact everyone, when it comes to inclusion, who are the most included people in the company? The bosses, the leaders. So the very people that are in charge of making decisions for the entire workforce are the same people that are the least aware of exclusion, that are the least able to understand what it is, that are the least able to fix it. I believe firmly that a lot of the reason for why progress has been so slow, I hear so many people complain about, oh, it's white supremacy fighting back. It's, it was only superficial beliefs in DI. Some of those things are true, but I think that there's a much more fundamental problem, which is that many of these people are simply not equipped and not able to understand what they need to do as business leaders, and simply telling them about the problems is not enough. So I think that I know a ton of people who look like me, who, given the right tools, given the right information, given the right data, would be more than happy to do the right thing. But simply pointing out that there's a lack of diversity or a lack of representation is not enough. Now, it turns out that what we can do is to extend this analogy with health by thinking about the way that doctors ask you about diseases. They don't just say, oh, hey, on a scale of 1 to 10, how healthy do you feel today? 7, great, take 3 aspirin and call me in the morning. How useless would that be? When we ask people in our companies, when we do inclusion surveys where we say, how included do you feel? That's exactly what we're doing. Or even better, when companies ask questions like, do you feel that this company is an inclusive environment? That's like going to a doctor because you don't feel well. And the doctor says, do you feel that this hospital is good for patients like you? That's completely useless, because you don't want to know how people feel. You need to understand the causes and the symptoms. And we realized that we could do exactly the same thing with inclusion. So if you think about inclusion, again, from the point of organization as being essentially a lack of health in the organization, what you need to understand are the symptoms and the causes. Oh, let's say in the case of health, oh, what's the matter? My stomach hurts. Okay, it's digestive. Did you eat something bad? Yes, I did. Okay, that's the cause. Well, in the workplace, we've come up with a series of categories that we call the experience categories. And what we do is we do an activity in which we ask people in a confidential way through a platform that I will show you in a few minutes to share things that happened to them in the workplace. And by the way, we're very careful. We don't say things that made you feel excluded, because that's already a bit of a red herring. That already assumes that you know that you're being excluded. Instead, all we want to know is, tell us about something that happened in your workplace that interfered with your ability to succeed or to perform. And then we ask you 2 things. One, which of these categories is the closest fit to what you're experiencing? Is it about access and participation? Is it about recognition? Is it about respect? So these are remember the bubbles that I showed you before that influence your satisfaction. But then we want to know what's causing it. And the cause is what we call the sources of experiences. So here you are in your company. It could be a workplace policy. It could be your leadership, your HR department, your management, your peers, your reports, or even people outside your organization, like your customers and partners. Just to give you an idea of the kind of data that we get. So we get these combined narratives of stories that people tell us of specific experiences that happen to them, and then the quantitative data in terms of the categories and the sources. I'm going to share with you just a few examples, but we have thousands and thousands of data points of people's experiences across a variety of different industries. Just to give you an idea, some of the ones that were categorized under respect. People at my organization making appropriate jokes about my age. By the way, these are all completely and fully anonymized. We do not know who wrote these, and we made sure that whenever we get anything, we ask for permission to share them in reports like this one, and they're completely confidential and anonymized. Here's another one. My manager reviled me in a vicious manner over a difference of opinion and screamed at me, calling me stupid 3 times in a private setting. Or how about this one? This was a senior technology person in a company, technology company, who said that after introducing myself, I've had individuals asked to speak to a guy who works in IT instead of me. So you can see how these kinds of things will clearly have a negative impact on your desire to be in that organization. And that will impact your performance, and it will impact your retention. Similarly with work-life balance, important meetings are held when I have to drop off my child at school. Or I was passed over for travel opportunities because I had young children at home, and it was assumed I could not travel even though I was never asked. Now, I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but some of these things clearly speak to gender, in this particular case, gender issues. But sometimes we see comments like if somebody says, my white male colleague, asked to touch my hair inappropriately. Well, then we know that that's probably happening to a black woman. I've never heard of a white man saying, "Oh, somebody wanted to touch my hair." See, I just got my hair cut very short. It actually feels kind of cool. And if somebody came up to me, that would be really weird. And the fact that, I'm being kind of lighthearted right now, but the point being is that sometimes you can see very clearly that these are forms of exclusion, but other times there are things that might impact a bunch of people. Like, I don't feel that it's acceptable to be unreachable even when I'm on vacation. And that may happen more to certain groups of people, but it may happen to everybody. It will likely happen to some white men as well. So when we work with organizations, what we do is that we do interactive workshops in which I go through a kind of a dog and pony show like the one that, talk about exactly the same kinds of things that I've been talking about. And then we invite people to a website where they can completely confidentially basically go through, and we talk about the confidentiality. We tell them that we don't know who they are. We don't give them a login, so we literally do not know who they are. And then we ask them for their location. And then based on that, we ask them some identity traits and job related traits. And these are like pull downs where you can say, I identify as and then you can choose depending on the location. This, for example, was for a European company. So you can see that we're asking for things like, are you identify or international company? So not just black, but black as African American, British black, African black, Caribbean black, Hispanic or Latinx or Latina and Latinx and so on and so forth. And we can adjust that. And then we ask some questions also about how long have you been in the company, what sort of job are you in, and some of those can be customized. And then we basically invite people to share experiences. So at the top, they'll start by typing an experience. For example, somebody might say, I found out that I'm paid less than my male colleague who's junior to me. And then we ask him to identify up to a maximum of 3 categories. And in this particular case, the category would be compensation and benefits, and also a source. And in this particular case, the source would be your direct manager. And then we also ask people about frequency. Is this something that is a one-off or does it happen frequently? And then the last thing is that we always, and by default, this is checked to no, we say, can we anonymously refer to this experience? And what we tell people is that, look, we're going to create a report for your leadership. They will not see any of the raw data. But when we give them clusters of data and we want to refer to specific experiences, it's incredibly powerful to be able to share the actual experience. And we find that because of the anonymity and because we guarantee that we will scrub anything that could be identifiable, we tend to get really high response rates. We tend to get somewhere between 50 and 85% of the answers will be checked. Yes, it's okay to share them. So how do we use the data? Well, we get the combination of quantitative data in terms of the categories, sources, and identity traits. And that really tells us immediately where are the biggest problems and opportunities for companies to increase their performance by increasing their level of inclusion. And qualitative data, or by increasing really the workplace experience. And then the qualitative data in terms of the actual descriptions, the stories that people tell us exactly what is happening. And it turns out that we have a way of combining the quantitative data. We have 2 key metrics that we care about. The first one, actually really 3, but the sort of the 2 core metrics are what we call the prevalence, which is essentially just telling us, is one kind of experience more prevalent than another kind of experience? Are there more people in the organization that complain about a certain thing? But because we also want to recognize that sometimes you have very small groups that are particularly impacted, we have a different metric, which you call the severity, which basically tells us, given that certain groups had problems in a particular category, did these people complain more about the category on average? And that tells us about what we call the severity. And then we combine those 2 with the frequency to come up with a single number that we call the exclusion score. And let me show you what that looks like. So we typically use the data to start out, before we even look at identity, we look at what we call the what and the why, and then the breadth of the depth of the issues. And then if we've collected identity data, we actually look at that as well. So let me explain what that looks like. Here's an example from a large data set from technology companies, in which now what I'm doing is I'm showing you the overall exclusion score. So high is bad. And you can see that in this case, I've rank ordered them from the least exclusion score to the highest exclusion score. And you can see that respect in this particular set of organizations was a really big problem. We see that in technology in particular, it's a huge problem, in finance, but unfortunately, in virtually every organization that we've seen, respect is either the top or the second highest category. Then we can do the same thing with the sources. In these cases, instead of ranking them by size, it's hierarchical. So policy, leadership, HR, et cetera, et cetera. But we see the thing that we find all the time. It's always about people, not policies. Leadership, direct managers, and peers are always the sources of most problems in the workplace. Shouldn't really surprise anyone, but it was nice to see that the data confirms that. In some companies, it's more peers. It depends also on the level, but it's very interesting for each company to drill down into that. And then we can also combine those two when we have enough data and look at the intersection of categories and sources to look for hotspots. So like here, for example, we see big problems with lack of respect from leadership and managers. But we also see a problem down here, for example, in policies that have to do with work-life balance. So that tells us about the what and the why. And then remember I told you about the breadth and the depth. So I told you about this idea that we can measure the prevalence, in other words, how many people are impacted versus the severity, which is how acute the problem is. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you the same data about the categories as before, but instead of showing them as a bar chart, I'm going to show you these bubbles where the bigger the bubble, the higher the exclusion score, but their position up and to the right means really bad. But if they're more to the right, it means that more people are impacted. If they're higher, it means that they're more severe. And here, what you start to see is some very interesting results. For example, we see that even though respect overall had the largest exclusion score, the biggest circle, you can see that for this particular set of people, career had the same level of prevalence. So that means that it's a very significant problem. But respect, if you think about it, it makes sense because career decisions are not made daily, but situations that feel like a lack of respect, like people being rude to you, some of the ones that I showed you earlier, those definitely are more likely to happen and therefore more acute. And then lastly, if we collect identity data through that form at the beginning, and I want to emphasize something. One of the things that several companies are now asking us to do because of all of the executive orders is, can we do the same thing without diversity data? And the answer is absolutely. Because if we find the problems and it says, okay, the biggest problem is the way the meetings are organized, and it's impacting 28% of your population, and you fix that problem, there is a really good chance that that problem is going to be that solution is going to be particularly beneficial for women, for people of color, for LGBTQ+, and so on and so forth. But you're truly helping everybody without having to refer to the identity. Nonetheless, we do measure identity, and we have been historically. And what we find is always, always, always that there is a profound difference between the more privileged groups and the more underappreciated, underprivileged, underrepresented groups. So here, for example, I'm just going to show you one very interesting study that we did a few years ago in which I'm showing you the 5 categories for the men. And remember, up and to the right is not good, right? And then here are the same 5 categories for the women. And you don't need to do statistical analysis to recognize that you've got a massive, massive problem. In most cases, the numbers are more than twice as large for women as they are for men. And then when you go and you look at the actual experiences, like the ones that I shared earlier, it can tell you exactly what is happening. And then you can choose, okay, I know how much money I'm losing because of this, and I can see exactly what needs to be done. And now if I fix it, I can actually estimate the ROI of whatever investment I need to make to fix whatever problem I found. I've talked here about gender, but as I said before, we can look at typically we collect data along 4 identity dimensions. We look at disability, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, and gender. And what we find is that, and I'm sorry, I'm going through this a bit quickly, but we find that the exclusion scores for people who are not members of the majority. So if you're a woman or anything other than male, if you identify as anything other than white, if you identify as having no disabilities, if you identify as being non-heterosexual, your scores are always significantly worse. So in a way, in fact, we also see intersectionality. Here, for example, I'm showing you those heat maps from that same data that I showed you earlier. And what we did is we separated out the data for women who identified as women of color, compared to those who identify as white men. And you can see when I said that inclusion is invisible, you can see that the white men, yellow was like the lowest possible scores. And you can see that white men virtually do not ever see exclusion or they never see negative experiences. Whereas look at these numbers for women of color. Pretty tremendous difference. So we have a dashboard. Actually, this is not just pictures from a dashboard, but we have a detailed interactive dashboard where we can drill into the data in many, many different ways and really find typically very obvious, very simple things that companies can do. We find that there are some low-hanging fruit. There's some low-hanging fruit that companies can fix really easily without pissing anybody off. And it's not about, oh, let's fix the problem for people with disabilities. Let's fix a problem for Black people. No, it's like, let's find the biggest problems and fix them, and it will benefit everyone. And I want to close by kind of using that to show you one final great benefit of inclusion, which is that if you know, you've all probably heard the experience, the expression that the rising tide lifts all boats equally. I think it was John F. Kennedy who said that when he was talking about the fact that investing in the economy actually lifts up everyone in the economy. With inclusion, it's even better than that. Because if you think of structural barriers as effectively creating uneven levels of well-being for the different groups as shown in this picture, if I rain down inclusion on the entire environment, what will happen is that I will disproportionately benefit the groups that were the most excluded. If I find that a lot of people complain about not being invited to meetings that impacted them, and I fix that problem by asking all managers to track who's invited to meetings, it will benefit women more than men. It will benefit Black people more than white people. It will benefit LGBTQ plus people more than heterosexual people, but it will also impact the maybe shy white men. And so you're benefiting truly everybody, and you're automatically benefiting the most disadvantaged or underappreciated groups without having to focus on that directly. So again, I hope you appreciated this. There are a lot of other reasons why the value of focusing on inclusion, but I also want to tell you that if you're interested in these topics, I published a book at the end of last year, and I'm actually happy to report that we've already won a couple of awards. Well, we're finalists in one business book award. We were the winner of the Goody Business Book Award, and we're in the running for a couple of other awards. If you are interested in a copy of the book, I have a discount code there. You're more than welcome to grab it. You're welcome to reach out to me. And the book goes into a lot more detail about all this work, but I wanted to make sure to leave some time. And so actually here, let me put this up here. If anybody wants to reach out to me, either go through ACT, go through Barry, or Kim, or any of Barry's colleagues that you're in touch with, or you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly. And again, we will be having more presentations on, they're really related to all of these topics, but I go into a lot more details on various aspects that are related to some of this work in diversity and inclusion. So with that, and I apologize that the chat is not open, but I think that Barry, you can manage that and let me know what you saw in the Q&A, and maybe tell people to unmute themselves if they wish to.
I don't think there was anything else in the Q&A, but like I said, I love this presentation. Every time I see it, I take some additional notes. So I do want to point it to the audience for anyone who'd like to ask any questions or just want to hear your feedback, because we'd love to hear what your thoughts are. How is this resonating for you? So if anyone would like to take themselves off of mute and just give us some feedback on how this session resonated for you, that would be wonderful. So I'll open the door for anyone to post a thought or a question. So anyone from the audience would like to share a thought with us, or are we all being bashful today?
I threw a lot of stuff at you.
I know, right? So I think there's a question. So I see a question in the chat. So let's see.
It's a great session. Thank you.
Great session. Thanks, Yanku. Appreciate it, and we're glad to see you here. Anyone else would like to share a thought or a question? There's some. Yeah, we've answered that one. Yeah. There's an open question. Nope, got that one. Okay. Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Any questions? So we're going to be doing a session here in a few weeks. Could you tee that up on how what you're talking about now will follow in this next conversation, and why they should be at this next session that's coming up on May 30th?
Yeah, and let me go ahead and flash that set of slides again. So one of the things that is a bit of an evolution of the work that I presented today is that we've been measuring inclusion now for about 6 or 7 years now, and we're collecting more and more data. And one of the things, even before the backlash became the way that it is right now, I started to realize that measuring inclusion is just one piece of the puzzle, and that if you think about, I've used an analogy at one point where I thought to myself, well, imagine the way that you run the finances of a company. You typically have 3 different kinds of reports. You have your balance sheet, your P&L, and your cash flow. And in a way, diversity is like your balance sheet. It's a statement of where you are today, and it's a reflection of everything that's happened, but it doesn't really tell you how it happened. Measuring inclusion, the way that we defined it, is really more about, it's like your cash flow. It's all of the pluses and minuses that increase and decrease the well-being and therefore the value of your individual human assets on a day-to-day basis. And the piece in between, which is what I've been calling equity, is what I think is like the P&L. It's looking at processes over a period of time and recognizing where you have some overall gains and losses. And so the linking DI to KPIs really formalizes the framework and really shows you how, as an organization, you can encourage your leaders to think about human assets the way they think about financial assets, and how that makes it much easier to link DEI to KPIs. And by the way, a little thing is that everybody's changing their terminology. Nobody's using DEI anymore. One of the things that we've been working on is recognizing that what we've been calling equity, which is a really kind of hot button topic, is really what people on the other side, if you will, call merit. And so one of the things that we're now talking about is measuring inclusion and merit for efficiency. So we're really trying to play to the kind of the hearts and minds of the people that have been sort of opposing DEI. And so I'll probably talk about that in that as well. I'll talk about in July then on biasing your organization. It's the recognition that a lot of problems are they have less to do with the behaviors of individuals, and they have more to do with processes in the organization that allow those behaviors to have a negative influence on a lot of people. So I talk about this whole idea of biases, how you can identify, recognize, and measure these organizational biases, and how that effectively boils down to measuring equity or merit, depending on what you want to call it. And we're going to talk about dealing with the DI backlash, some of the, and I have a whole thing in my book. I have 2 chapters, one of them where I pick apart some of the flawed thinking that we've been doing on the DEI side, and then I pick apart the flawed thinking that people have been doing on the anti-DEI side. And then the 6 steps to measure inclusion is for people that are interested in doing this on their own without necessarily having to hire a company like Aleria, where we'll kind of go through, and really that's a lot about tips and so it'll be a lot of the same ideas, but it'll assume that somebody's taken this, has been to this workshop, and that we'll be able to say, okay, well, how would you do it? What are going to be some of the pitfalls? What are going to be some of the things that you should really be doing if you're going to be doing this on your own? How can you do it without using an online platform like ours? And then the last one is more about the dangers of setting DI targets based on diversity alone, and how to avoid some of those problems. And this goes back to the idea of what I said earlier, that one of your goals should be to drive inequities to 0. And as I said, there's a few other things that I'm working on. We may want to put something more relevant by the time we get especially to the back end of the series here.
Yep. So there's a question. So from
Oh.
Alicia, how are there trainings or any development advice you would recommend to get people in a work environment ready to do the work of inclusion?
Well, sort of self-observing. I've actually been trying to get people, like, for example, Barry came to one of my other talks that was like one of our free and open webinars. And I was like, oh my God, this is so interesting. You need to come and do some training for my organization. I always love to get invited to speak to organizations because of the following reasons. You could easily buy my book. In fact, I do some of these workshops free regularly. You can find videos, you can find my TED Talk. You can certainly read any of that. You can look for me on Forbes. I've been writing a lot very extensively. There is something about having a white dude come in and talk to a bunch of leaders, and I hate to say it, but it sucks, but I have incredible privilege and I use it. I know that I can walk into a room and they'll say, oh my God, this guy's got a PhD. He was a professor. He's given TED Talks. He's written a book, and they will listen to me in a very different way. So I would encourage you, anybody that wants to get a copy of my book, let me know. As I said, it's not very expensive. There's a discount code, but anybody that wants to convince their leadership and, invite me to speak. And we charge for that, but we try to keep the prices very reasonable, and we love to get the word out. So happy to help with that if that's of any interest to anyone.
And this is why we partner with him to actually host these webinars to kind of set the groundwork, because if we can begin to kind of shift the narrative around this conversation, we think we can do some great work on really, in a sense, building a capacity for measuring inclusion and building inclusion in our organization and the entire ecosystem, especially within the clean energy sector. So we think this is important. So we'd invite more of your partners, your colleagues, your leaders to some of these webinars, so that way you can begin to kind of start the dialogue around this conversation, and think that will be helpful and supportive. So great question. And so like that, is there any other questions in the group before we give you back your time?
Yeah. And by the way, if I can, while we're waiting for any more questions, to underscore something you said, it would be great if you all help us to spread the word and invite other people. And even though there's not going to be a lot of repetition, there will be a tiny bit of repetition in each of these, but they're all meant to be standalone. so that if you've been to the first one, you will still get a lot of value. But even if you have not been to the first one, first of all, you can get it. You can get the recording. I'm assuming that that ACT will make it available.
Yep.
And then secondly, people should find it pretty interesting. So I hope you will spread the word and invite even more people to come the next time.
So last things, thank you so much. I love this. I'm excited about this. There will be a survey that will be short coming out to you, plus a post email just letting you know about the next coming event. So actually encourage people to register, share this information, and continue the dialogue. Also tell us what other topics we think we need to get out there and do. We ACT wants to serve as this catalyst for this conversation. And so we're excited about the partnership. So once again, have an amazing day. And we appreciate you all and continue to do the good work of inclusion out in your organizations and what you do. So have an amazing day, everyone. Oh, there was a
Thank
question.
you. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.